How to make buildings a part of the energy transition. This is Energy Matters with Claire and Dan. Dan's traveling today, so I have the pleasure of speaking with Véronique Bugnion. Véronique is a PhD, a scientist, an entrepreneur, and an energy industry leader. She's the co-founder and CEO of Clearly Energy, a provider of innovative solutions to reduce building emissions. She also was global head of carbon and natural gas for Thomson Reuters. Prior to working with Thomson Reuters and Point Carbon, she worked with Goldman Sachs and Constellation Commodities Group, which is where I met her. And she focused there on the deregulated power, natural gas, and emissions markets. Today, she's also an adjunct professor at Hopkins and teaches climate finance. Véronique, thanks so much for being here. Welcome to the show.
Of course. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. All right. So for years, energy efficiency was seen as the low-hanging fruit of climate policy. But today, with electrification accelerating and power demand rising, how do you see the future of energy efficiency evolving?
So energy efficiency can mean a lot of different things to different people, right? You can swap out old systems for new ones, and we got a lot of bang for our buck, for example, swapping out light bulbs, and that really was the low-hanging fruit. The simple swap out math is a little harder to do on a lot of things, right? Insulating walls tends to be pretty expensive. But there's a lot of other things in energy efficiency world, right? You can optimize systems, the systems that you have, and I think there's a ton of potential there. Properly sizing and optimizing heating and cooling systems, heat pumps, leveraging the flexibility of water heaters, and then finally there's the category of adding new systems for efficiency. And so if you can add battery storage to a building, for example, you can reduce things like some of the payments that the building might owe. If you've got solar and storage, you can start connecting buildings into virtual power plants, moving electricity to lower emitting hours. So there's a lot of creative things that can be done on the efficiency front.
And I would say that's really different than 20 years ago when we first started talking about this, or even 10 years ago when I was at the Department of Energy, 15 years ago at the Department of Energy when I was running the weatherization assistance program for low-income households. And really the arrows in our quiver were air sealing, insulation, new windows, which were too expensive, and HVAC systems, which were too expensive. There's all sorts of new control mechanisms and energy management systems that we really didn't have or weren't super easy to access or install before. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so you're right that for a long time, and it's still true, for a lot of folks in the space, energy efficiency meant reducing consumption first and foremost. And there's, I think, still plenty to do there. For example, you just mentioned building energy management, lighting controls, temperature sensors, ventilation controls. There's a lot that can be done with that, and that should be done to make, buildings in particular much more dynamic grid participants. But I think there's also a lot of newer things that can be done if you think of buildings, right, they're nice static chunks of load, and they should be a dynamic part of the grid as opposed to just be grid off-takers, which is what they historically have been.
Yeah. And are you talking about commercial, industrial, large load buildings? Are you talking about homeowners or both?
I mean, at some point it'll have to be both, right?
I agree.
deal mostly with larger buildings, and so I'm thinking of them, of more kind of more savvy participants, more dollars at stake. There definitely are efforts to, aggregate smaller buildings into and residential homes into VPPs, putting batteries together. And that's all fine and good. To me, the low-hanging fruit, if there is some now, are the larger buildings, which have more at stake, especially if we enter a world of fairly rapidly increasing energy rates.
Right. And I think that's really the key to a lot of this, Véronique, right? So, I mean, I think, when we were talking about this, say, the mid-2010s, 2015, it was always the conversation where you're talking to a commercial industrial building owner about financing stuff for them. It was like, well, I could put in a new HVAC system for you that no one will see, or I could put in a glitzy new lobby. And they always chose the glitzy new lobby, right? Because HVAC systems are boring. But now that their utility rates have gone up astronomically, they're a lot less boring because you're spending a lot of money on energy that you could ostensibly not be doing with more energy efficient systems. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. And then, not to jump the gun on our conversation, but when you are in cities and states that are starting to impose, targets on buildings, then you have not just the basic math of cost avoidance with more advanced systems, but you also have to avoid potential penalties associated with these programs. And so specifically in those regions, you are starting to create a stack of incentives to really change things.
Right. Right. Now, I'm familiar with local law 84 and 87, but tell us a little bit more about who is creating regulatory forcing that is requiring energy efficiency for large commercial industrial buildings.
Yeah, so if you take a step back, right, and you look a couple years back, traditionally on the building side of things, you had two types of policies. You had building codes, which are fine, building energy codes that only impacts new construction or sort of total overhauls of buildings. So that leaves out 99 point some percent of the building stock, right? And then you had incentives. And so the whole premise of the IRA was creating sufficiently, juicy incentives for anybody from homeowners to larger buildings to take action. Historically, we'll never know really how the IRA would have panned out, but historically, that hasn't worked that well in the sense that the emissions of the building, if you take, buildings as a sector of the economy, it's a hard to decarbonize sector that hasn't been doing very well in terms of reducing its emissions. And so 7 or 8 years ago, a couple US cities, starting with New York City and the District of Columbia, passed city ordinances that essentially set targets on buildings. These are only large buildings. Think of, anything above 20 or so thousand square feet. All types of buildings, whether it's office building, a hospital, a school or university campus, multifamily building. And those programs are all different in design, but conceptually think of them as trying to ratchet down in sort of 5-year intervals the emissions or the consumption of the large building stock and try to drive them towards, say, net zero by 2050 or something along those lines. So lots of differences in the details, but the basic premise is to make those buildings accountable for their energy consumption and their emissions.
Right. But they all have differing levels of sort of sticks. And if you think of incentives as carrots and requirements as sticks, there are several of those new rules and regulations. I'm thinking specifically in the state of New Jersey, where there aren't really any repercussions if you don't meet those rules. Is that still correct?
Yeah, that's right. So across the US, there are now 4 or 5 states. That includes Oregon, Colorado, Maryland, the District of Columbia, the state of California, that are actually imposing targets and penalties on buildings. There's also a bunch of really important cities, starting with New York City, Boston, Cambridge, and a few others. St. Louis, Missouri, for example, Reno, Nevada. Those are real compliance programs with real penalties attached to them. Beyond that, there are 30 some programs that are kind of the first step towards this, that are simply asking buildings to report their energy use on an annual basis. Right. And so what we do at Clearly Energy is to manage these programs and all of the reporting components that go along with them for both the reporting part, which is generally referred to as benchmarking, and the compliance part, which is referred to as building performance standards, or BEPS.
So, Veronique, first off, tell me a little bit more about what Clearly Energy does.
So we are a software company. We work with jurisdictions. We work with cities and states. We work with 5 or 6 states and 30 or so cities across the country. And we help manage the data collection and the reporting requirements for both benchmarking and building performance standard programs. So in New York City, the program is known as Local Law 97. It's actually very big. It involves 60,000 buildings. Each one of those buildings has to turn in their energy data every year. And then from there are a number of, like all good policy programs, there are a number of complexities associated with the program that need to be tracked. And so we then track, who's in compliance, who's not in compliance, how far away from compliance is each and every building in New York City, in the District of Columbia, and so
Sounds
forth.
pretty complicated. Okay, so to lift up another level, tell us what percentage of U.S. emissions come from buildings right now?
Yeah, so buildings are, give or take, a third of U.S. emissions, split about evenly between residential, so, homes, and I'm going to say commercial, but that's really anything that's bigger than, a single family home. Um, and there's two big pieces to those emissions. One is the electricity used from the grid, right? So any grid decarbonization benefits buildings and building emissions, and the rest is what's called on-site emissions. And think of that as, the boiler or the furnace in the basement that's burning gas or oil. So it's about a third nationwide, but when you look at city emissions, it's more. Obviously, the denser the urban area, the higher the proportion of building emissions. So for cities, it's anywhere from 50 or so percent in a place like Denver that's fairly sprawled out to closer to 80% or around 75% for a place like New York City.
Right, which is
So
just enormous.
which is huge, right? So for any city that writes a nice little climate or big climate action plan and realizes that the bulk of their emissions is buildings, there's kind of no way going around new policies to tackle the emissions from existing buildings.
Right. Okay. And so what you're saying is really building performance standards are what is required for these cities to meet climate goals.
Yes, it's a core part of meeting their objectives.
Let's talk a little bit about something that I often hear merged together, but it's really not. There's some confusion between decarbonization and electrification. How do you distinguish the two, and where does energy efficiency fit into that paradigm?
Yeah, so in many ways, they go hand in hand, right? If you think simply that electric systems, whether it's EVs, whether it's heat pumps, whether it's induction stoves, right, are 2 or 3 times more efficient than their fossil counterparts, that makes the two processes go very much hand in hand. Now, if beyond that, you can get the grid to be cleaner, then the added benefit of electrifying in terms of translating the electrification into decarbonization becomes, even bigger, if that makes sense.
It does. But I mean, at the end of the day, if you're electrifying something with fossil fuel, you're still using fossil fuel to generate the electricity, right? So
That's right. But the
yeah.
premise is that you have an efficiency gain that simply happens from the electrification itself. And then you can build on that by, I don't want to say hoping, but by having a grid that becomes cleaner over time.
Right. And that is where I honestly think that energy efficiency is going to shine in the next bunch of years, because we're all talking about the grid and the fact that the grid is old and aging and cannot meet the load that is required. And we need more distributed generation resources and generating electricity where you use it. Where does energy efficiency fit into that? I assume if you're using less energy, you're not taxing the grid as much, but there's much more to that, right, Veronique?
I mean, yes and no, right? Because if you electrify, you're going to start by increasing electric loads. If you put a heat pump, whether it's a home or a building, the first thing that happens is gas consumption goes down, but electricity consumption goes up. So if not timed well and done well with the right kind of programs and incentives, you could be compounding and adding to the grid issue side of things. That said, I'm a firm believer that buildings in particular, and large buildings in particular, which are these, big static chunks of load, are underused in terms of providing grid flexibility services. And the incentives just haven't been there. But when you have a program like the one in New York, which creates real incentives in terms of real financial penalties for not meeting the emissions targets, you're creating incentives to reduce electricity consumption, to reduce emissions. Oftentimes those two go hand in hand, but I think there's a lot of room to be creative with, building decarbonization, not adding stress to the grid.
Right. And then how do building performance standards interact with grid constraints then?
In a way, not enough. Now, building performance standards are a very bottom-up policy movement. It's a very dynamic policy movement, right? All of these policies are new and have been put in place or are being put in place as we speak. Like California is literally writing its rules right now.
Hmm.
So
And
some
what you
of
mean by
them,
bottom up, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you mean city by city. It's
yeah,
not a federal.
city
Right.
by
Okay.
city, state by
Yeah.
state. So there's no common model. It maybe is a little maddening for the large portfolios of buildings out there. But that means that some jurisdictions have taken the approach to reduce the energy consumption of buildings, right? So their target metric is energy consumption per square foot. Some other jurisdictions have chosen to target greenhouse gas emissions per square foot as their target metric. Those two things don't necessarily generate the same types of decarbonization incentives for buildings, right? If you're in an energy unit, then in a way it's back to very conventional efficiency, right? How do you reduce building energy consumption? Well, you start with the cheapest stuff and you work your way through the list. There's insulation, there's windows, there's the systems themselves. All of that will reduce energy consumption, right? How it's divided between electricity and fuels, TBD, but it only drives things in one direction. If you are, for example, New York City, you have a greenhouse gas per square foot target by type of building. And what that means is then it becomes an informed policy decision as much as anything else. You're in a state with an ambitious grid decarbonization policy. And so your best bet is likely to be to electrify systems more rapidly rather than not, and then ride down the grid decarbonization curve if you believe that that's really, going to happen. And that initial step of essentially let's electrify everything, that can have a different kind of impact on the grid. So it will really depend on the details of how these policies are constructed and implemented.
Well, it depends on those details, and it also depends on the regional issues associated with it, right? In the sense that California has the duck curve, and we at Energy Matters with Claire and Dan did a whole episode on the duck curve. But what's happening in New England is completely different, where New England is going to have a nighttime winter demand peak, right? And so maybe for listeners, you can explain, why is there a winter demand peak in New England, and how are our building performance standards going to be used to try to impact that?
That's a great question. I mean, the colder the climate, the more, energy of all kinds, whether it's fossil based or whether it's electric based, goes into meeting heating system demand. That can be a combination of the electricity used to assist fossil systems in terms of motors, or it can be the fossil use directly. I think where the design of some of these programs, I don't want to say starting to go, but where it could go is by allowing ways of complying that help the grid. And so I'll give you a couple examples. One example is allowing buildings to comply as campuses, right? So not having a single building, every building comply, but allowing them to comply as large bundles of buildings. If you look at Cambridge, there are over both MIT and Harvard have over 100 buildings in Cambridge. And so they're complying as an aggregate, which means that they have a lot of flexibility internally to figure out which buildings need to have systems changed anyway today and leverage that, and which buildings should wait. The other piece of policy, which I'm a big fan of, even though it's definitely complicated, but that's the one that really gets to working with the grid, is one offered by a number of places. Certainly Cambridge, certainly New York City is the key one, and it's allowing buildings to comply with hourly grid emissions rates as opposed to a single number across the year. So if you think about what happens there potentially, is the large demand hours tend to also be the highest emitting hours. And so if you're allowing buildings to move their demand between the highest emitting hours to the lower emitting hours, for example, by adding a battery in the building, you're creating a really positive incentive to move load not just to lower emitting hours, but those also tend to be less stressed hours on the grid. And so this is how you make buildings a dynamic part of the grid and a dynamic part of the solution. So there's a long way to go. This is all very, very new. 2025 was the first year of compliance for New York City. DC is a few years in. So we really don't have any experience yet with how this is going to work. But I think the potential is there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I also think, the utilities have their place in this, and creating time of use rates or TOU rates is something that's worked remarkably well. I mean, electricity is much more expensive in California from 4 p.m. to 9 p.m. So people are using less electricity during those times, right? And that's not a building performance standard, and that's not building by building, but that's any utility user is choosing to change the times when they use their energy so that the grid is less constrained at those times. And PJM, as an example, is paying their customers to stop using as much load in those coincident peak hours, as an example. So I think what you're saying is the building performance standards and utility incentive structures, all of those things are needed in order to tax the grid less. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I think the policies that you've mentioned, those that exist, are essentially pushing on the dollars buttons, right? Trying to move load to respond to the hours with a lower tariff. And that's all fine and good when you layer on a building performance standard, certainly one that's designed, for example, in greenhouse gas units. You're trying to not only avoid the most costly hours, but also avoid the highest emitting hours at the same time. They don't completely overlap, but there's a large element of overlap between the two. So the incentives are actually driving in the same direction. But you're trying to save the electricity costs on the one hand, but you're also trying to avoid emissions and to avoid the penalties that are potentially associated with these emissions. So if you really push the logic, you get something that's really, really potentially very beneficial to the grid and to the environment all at once.
So we're going to pivot the conversation a little bit, Veronique, and I'm interested in chatting with you about something we've talked about a lot over the years, which is women in energy. And you and I have both worked across legacy energy and the new energy transition. What has it been like for you navigating that evolution as a woman?
I look back and I will say it's been fun. I guess I naturally have a pretty thick skin. I mean, I'm sure you do as well. I have vivid memories of being the only woman in the room, right? Trying to explain
Absolutely.
deregulated power markets to a bunch of guys twice my age wearing pocket protectors. I've been called really bad things across a trading floor full of like 200 guys. Definitely some very cringe-inducing moments. And I don't think the new energy systems come with nearly that much baggage. They're a lot more technology centric. I don't think batteries or solar are really coded as being male centric the way legacy systems were.
Right. And when you mean legacy, you mean what we were doing at Constellation on the trading floor, talking about coal-fired power plants and nuclear plants and
Yeah,
natural gas plants
exactly. The
and like
whole, and in a way, the whole
trading and
infrastructure, but the
yeah.
whole, big power plants, big fossil systems. So I think I see a lot of positive things happening there. I certainly see that at Clearly Energy, there's really like we're trying to implement some really interesting new policies, and there's never any sense of a bunch of girls being in an old boys world at all.
Which is
Um,
wonderful, right? I mean, it's markedly different across our careers, don't you think?
oh, it's huge. It's
Yeah.
yes, and being forced to look back definitely highlights that. At the same time, I will say that when I'm at a conference talking to other CEOs, like we can still count on a couple fingers and, not even any toes, how many of us there are in the space. And
Right.
so there's a definite shortage of women startups, I think, still in the energy space. I don't really know the detailed numbers. I'm not entirely sure why. I have kind of my hypotheses, but I think that problem still needs fixing.
Yeah. Well, you are a startup founder and I am a startup founder and we're female, but they are few and far between. And every conference I go to, it's at less than 10% female at best, right?
At best.
Still.
Yeah.
And most meetings as well, we're still the only woman in the room, though you and I are hiring more women. And I know you and I have spent a lot of our careers trying to support young women in this field to make sure that we aren't the only women in the room. And it's people like you who are making a difference in that space, which I applaud. But, we also see the statistics that I think that most recent number is only 2% of VC dollars goes to female started companies, which is still pretty pitiful, right? And is it because we're too aggressive and female? Is it because people trust women less? I mean, what do you think it is, Veronique?
I don't know. My only view and maybe experience, specifically with trying to get, an energy startup through funding rounds, is the energy side is not necessarily used to seeing a ton of women, and there's an element of reaction to that. But then there are funds that focus strictly on women startups, but they are used to, not, I don't want to stereotype, but I'm going to, is they're used to seeing a lot of, retail, fashion, whatever types of startups. So they don't understand the energy side. So I think we're getting, I don't want to say crushed on both
Both
sides, but
sides.
we don't appeal to the women folk centric types of funding mechanisms out there, and we're still a little bit scary and off the beaten path for the energy side. And so I think if you put the two together, it creates a gap, right, for women energy startups. But I'm sure that that's changing. I think a lot of what I'm saying is probably stuff that's a little bit in the past, or hopefully in the past.
Hopefully, it's becoming more in the past. I think at the end of the day, though, people like investing in and working with people who look like them and act like them. It's more comfortable. I think that's really human nature. And I think, networks still matter a lot, which is why, women have to support other women and develop our own networks. I just wish it were a bit easier to enter other networks.
Yes. Oh, that's certainly fair.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what structural barriers do you think there are that remain invisible to people who aren't experiencing them?
I'm not sure, but I've certainly experienced the issue with women centric funds that simply look at you as a women energy entrepreneur and say, sorry, I don't understand this area, right? Because everybody has to specialize. So I think, and I'm sure that is generically true of a number of sectors where there just are not a lot of women run companies, whether it's, it's like, I don't know, civil engineering firms, right? Civil
Sure.
engineering startups, probably the same thing. So I don't know how we get to critical mass of numbers, or I don't know if there's a third way that's needed beyond kind of energy funding and women funding to sort of bring the two together. But yeah, that's my experience of where things get tough.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's right. So I think what I'd like to close with you today is if we fast forward 15 years, what does a well-functioning decarbonized building and power system look like?
That's a great question. In a way, I'm hoping maybe solar and batteries will be so cheap that we won't even need the grid, that we can just oversize systems, maybe not across the board. It certainly won't make sense across the board, but in a number of places, I do think that more and more things should be grid interactive. I don't know, maybe we need like grid interactive hair dryers that dial up and down, depending on what the real-time prices are. I jokingly, as joking aside, I think there's a ton of potential to make a lot of systems grid interactive. And yeah, I think there's also a fairly urgent need to redesign the markets to work with the grid as it's evolving. I think one of my key concerns is not renewables being able to grow. I think they've got the financials on their side, but is then having a grid that doesn't know how to handle, not so much from a like an nuts and bolts operational standpoint, but from a financial standpoint. You can't have a whole bunch of of zero marginal cost power out there competing against one another, because then nobody will be able to make that work. So I think there definitely are challenges, but I think there's a ton of opportunity ahead.
Well, I think that's positive and a good way to end this episode. Véronique, thank you so much for joining us with Energy Matters with Claire and Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.